Following story is a translated and adapted conversation, recounting supernatural experiences from around the world. This content is intended for entertainment purposes only. Listen with an open mind and enjoy the thrill of the unknown. The content in this video is purely for entertainment. Viewer discretion is advised. If you are easily frightened, be prepared some stories might just send chills down your spine. If you're ready, turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and immerse yourself in the world of the unexplained. Whispers in the wind. In the dense heart of Thailand's ancient forest, where the trees stood tall and twisted, and sunlight barely pierced through the thick canopy, Nietzsche found herself surrounded by the hum of nature. Leaves rustled above, birds chirped in the distance, and the subtle breeze carried the scent of damp earth and wildflowers. It was supposed to be a peaceful solo trek, a break from the chaos of city life, a chance to breathe. Nietzsche had always felt at ease in the wilderness, her spirit connected to the serene isolation of the mountains. The locals, however, had warned her, "Don't stay too long after sunset." An elderly woman at the village base camp had whispered, her eyes filled with caution. The wind carries voices in these woods, voices that don't belong to the living. Nietzsche had brushed it off as superstition, just another ghost story meant to spook travelers. But now, standing alone in the heart of the forest, she wasn't so sure. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Shadows stretched across the forest floor, twisting and bending with the swaying branches. Nietzsche set up her tent beside an ancient tree whose gnarled roots formed a natural barrier, offering a sense of security. As she prepared her evening meal, the forest grew quieter. The birds ceased their songs, and the usual buzz of insects faded, leaving only the whispering wind. It danced between the branches, curling around the leaves, brushing against her skin like a cold breath. Then, she heard it. A faint whisper, so delicate it could have been mistaken for the rustling leaves. But it was there, unmistakable, a voice, soft and distant, carried by the breeze. Nietzsche. Her body froze, the spoon clattering from her hand, scattering grains of rice onto the dirt. She spun around, eyes wide, searching the tree line. There was no one, only the shadows, only the trees. A chill crept down her spine. It was impossible. She was alone. There were no other hikers, no nearby villages. No one knew her name out here. The wind picked up again, swirling through the branches, whispering softly. Nietzsche, come. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow. It was her name, clear and haunting, drifting on the cold evening air. She stumbled back, pressing herself against the tree, eyes darting around the darkening forest. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice trembling, echoing through the silence. The forest answered only with the whispering wind. Nietzsche's mind raced. It had to be a trick of the wind, a play of sound through the branches. There was no other explanation. Yet the voice had been so clear, so familiar, almost human. Shaking off the unease, she tried to focus, forcing herself to breathe. "Just the wind," she whispered to herself. "Just my imagination." But the sun had dipped lower, the sky darkening to shades of purple and gray. Shadows grew longer, twisting and merging, forming shapes that danced at the corner of her vision. She quickly finished her meal, the taste turning to ash in her mouth, her senses on high alert. Her eyes flicked to the tree line, watching, waiting for any movement, but there was nothing. As night descended, she retreated into her tent, zipping it up tight, wrapping herself in her sleeping bag, trying to find warmth. But the cold clung to her, seeping into her bones, carrying the echo of that voice. The forest outside was silent, unnervingly so. No nocturnal calls, no rustling leaves, just stillness. Until the whisper came again, "Nietzsche, come follow." Her blood ran cold, every muscle in her body tensing. The voice was closer this time, soft and pleading, just outside her tent. It was familiar, terribly familiar, like a long-lost friend calling out. The air grew colder, and the tent fabric fluttered gently as if someone had brushed past it. Nietzsche's heart raced, her body paralyzed with fear. She squeezed her eyes shut, covering her ears, her lips trembling as she whispered, "It's not real, it's not real." But the whisper persisted, seeping through the thin fabric, curling around her like cold smoke. "Nietzsche, don't leave me, come." A tear slipped down her cheek. The voice. It sounded just like her sister who had passed away years ago. Her body shook, her mind torn between fear and sorrow, between reality and the impossible. The whisper grew softer, more desperate. Nietzsche, please, I'm so cold, so lost. Her chest tightened, memories flooding back, memories of her sister's face, her laugh, her tearful goodbye, the night she never came back. The wind outside picked up, swirling around the tent, the whisper mingling with its cold breath. Nietzsche, help me. Her resolve crumbled, the sorrow overpowering the fear. She had always wished for one more chance, one more moment to see her sister again. With trembling hands, she reached for the zipper, her heart pounding. She had to see. She had to know. The whisper was waiting, just beyond the thin fabric, pulling her closer, luring her into the darkness. Her fingers gripped the zipper. She hesitated, her breath shaky, her heart aching. Then, she pulled. The cold air rushed in, freezing and sharp. The forest lay before her, silent and dark, shadows dancing between the trees. But no one was there. Only the wind, whispering through the leaves, echoing her name. Nietzsche. The darkness stared back at her, empty and endless. But she could feel it, the presence just beyond the shadows, waiting, watching. And the whisper, soft and sweet, called her deeper into the woods. Nietzsche, come home. The night air was frigid, wrapping itself around Nietzsche as she knelt at the entrance of her tent, staring into the darkness. The whisper lingered, echoing softly between the trees. Nietzsche, come home. Her heart twisted painfully, the voice so achingly familiar that it pulled at her very soul. It was her sister's voice, the same gentle tone, the same sorrowful plea. But how could it be? Her sister was gone, lost to the world of the living. Yet the whisper was here, floating on the night breeze, calling her name. Nietzsche's fingers dug into the dirt, cold and damp beneath her touch. Her body trembled, not from the chill but from the overwhelming urge to follow the voice. She stood, her legs unsteady, her eyes fixed on the shadowy tree line. The forest seemed alive, the branches swaying, their twisted shapes forming ghostly figures in the dim moonlight. The voice called again, softer this time, more desperate. Nietzsche, I'm so cold, please. Her heart shattered, the pain resurfacing as memories flooded back, memories of her sister's laughter, her smile, the warmth of her embrace. Memories of the day they found her lifeless body, washed up by the riverbank, her face pale and cold. A tear slipped down Nietzsche's cheek, her vision blurring. She took a step forward, then another, her feet moving on their own, drawn by the voice. The wind swirled around her, cold fingers brushing against her skin, guiding her toward the shadows. The trees loomed above, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms. Nietzsche, don't leave me, come follow. The whisper grew fainter, drifting deeper into the woods. Nietzsche's heart raced, fear mingling with sorrow. Her sister sounded so lost, so alone. She couldn't leave her behind. Not again. She stumbled forward, her footsteps crunching on fallen leaves, her breath visible in the cold air. The darkness swallowed her, the forest growing denser, the shadows closing in. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. The whisper continued, weaving through the trees, leading her deeper into the night. The ground grew uneven, roots twisting beneath her feet, trying to trip her. Branches scratched at her skin, snagging her clothes, as if the forest itself was trying to hold her back, but she pushed on, following the voice. Then, the air grew colder, the wind howling between the trees, carrying the faint echo of a sob. Nietzsche, it's so dark I can't find the way, help me. Her heart clenched, the sorrow cutting through her like a knife. She broke into a run, her feet pounding against the forest floor, the shadows rushing past her. The trees grew denser, the darkness thicker, pressing in on her. Her breaths came out in gasps, her body trembling, but she kept moving, driven by the voice that called to her. Nietzsche, don't leave me. She stumbled, her foot catching on a root. She fell hard, the earth cold and damp beneath her. Pain shot through her knees, but she barely felt it, her eyes searching the shadows. Ahead, through the twisted branches, she saw a figure, a silhouette standing beneath an ancient tree, its gnarled branches reaching toward the sky. Her breath caught in her throat, her heart pounding. The figure was small, frail, wrapped in tattered white cloth that fluttered in the breeze. Long hair cascaded down its shoulders, swaying gently. Nietzsche, the voice whispered, the figure's head tilting, eyes glowing softly in the darkness. Come take my hand. The voice was filled with longing, sadness, and a coldness that seeped into Nietzsche's bones. But it was her sister's face, the same delicate features, the same sorrowful eyes. Tears streamed down Nietzsche's face, her chest aching. Her sister looked so lost, so broken. How could she leave her here, alone in the darkness? Her body moved on its own, her hands reaching out, her voice trembling. I'm here, I'm coming. The figure's lips curled into a faint smile, the shadows flickering around it. It reached out, its hand pale and delicate, fingers elongated and cold. Nietzsche's fingers brushed against its icy skin, a chill shooting through her arm. But she didn't pull back, her sister needed her. The shadows around the figure shifted, twisting and swirling, shapes forming behind it, faces distorted in agony, mouths open in silent screams. Nietzsche's heart stilled, fear flooding her body as the air grew colder, the darkness pressing in. But the figure's grip tightened, cold and unyielding, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. Nietzsche, don't leave me, stay forever. The voice changed, warping into a hollow echo, inhuman and cold. The figure's face twisted, its smile stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp teeth. The shadows behind it moved, crawling closer, their faces contorted in despair. They reached out, skeletal hands grasping, eyes empty and hollow. Nietzsche screamed, trying to pull away, but the grip tightened, freezing her in place. The air grew colder, the shadows whispering her name, their voices a cacophony of sorrow and pain. She struggled, her body trembling, her breath visible in the freezing air. But the figure wouldn't let go, its smile widening, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. Nietzsche, stay with me forever. The shadows swirled around her, cold hands brushing against her skin, pulling her down, deeper into the darkness. Her vision blurred, her body growing numb as the cold seeped into her bones. The whisper surrounded her, echoing in her mind, soft and mournful. Nietzsche, Nietzsche. Her strength faded, her body sinking into the cold earth, the shadows consuming her. The last thing she saw was her sister's face, twisted in a smile, her eyes glowing in the darkness. Then, there was only the whisper, Nietzsche, come home. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the echo of her name, drifting through the shadows. But Nietzsche was gone, lost to the darkness, her voice joining the whispering wind, and the forest was silent once more. Morning light seeped through the canopy, casting pale rays onto the forest floor. Ken and May sat by the smoldering campfire, faces pale, eyes heavy with worrying. Nietzsche's gone, May whispered, her voice trembling. She was right there, and then Ken's jaw tightened, his fists clenched. I heard it, to the voice calling her name. But it was wrong. It wasn't human. They stood, scanning the surrounding trees. The forest seemed unchanged, the leaves rustling softly, birds singing somewhere in the distance. Yet, there was an eerie stillness, a coldness that lingered in the air. Ken's eyes narrowed. We have to find her. May hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. What if she's not alone out there? Ken didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the dense foliage. He wouldn't leave her behind. Not to whatever was lurking in this cursed forest. They followed the faint trail Nietzsche had taken, the undergrowth crunching beneath their boots. The air grew colder, shadows growing longer as they ventured deeper. A whisper floated on the breeze. Can May help me? May's face went pale, her hands shaking. That's Nietzsche's voice. Ken grabbed her arm, his voice firm. Stay close, don't listen to it. They moved cautiously, the trees closing in, the shadows twisting around them. The whisper grew louder, echoing through the branches, the voice soft and mournful. Why did you leave me? May's shoulders shook, tears glistening in her eyes. She sounds so sad. Ken's jaw clenched, his fists tightening. It's not her, it's trying to trick us. But his own heart ached at the sound. The voice laced with sorrow, with betrayal. It sounded so real, so much like Nietzsche. The air grew colder, their breath visible in the frigid mist that curled around their feet. The whisper continued, soft and haunting. Come back, don't leave me alone. They stumbled upon a clearing, ancient trees towering above, their twisted branches entwined like skeletal fingers. In the center stood an ancient shrine, half buried in moss and vines. The air grew heavy, the ground cold and damp. A chill ran down Ken's spine, the hair on his neck standing on end. May shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. I feel like we're being watched. Ken's eyes darted around, scanning the shadows. The air was thick with a presence, cold and suffocating. He could feel eyes on him, hidden among the trees, watching, waiting. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, its silhouette barely visible. It was small, frail, wrapped in tattered white cloth that fluttered in the breeze. Long hair cascaded down its shoulders, swaying gently. Nietzsche, May gasped, running forward. Ken reached out, grabbing her arm. Wait, don't. But May broke free, stumbling toward the figure, tears streaming down her face. Nietzsche, it's me, it's May. The figure's head tilted, its face shadowed, eyes glowing faintly. It took a step forward, its feet barely touching the ground, movements unnaturally smooth. Nietzschekin whispered, his heart pounding, but something was wrong. The air grew colder, a sickening chill spreading through his body. The figure's lips curled into a faint smile, its eyes unblinking, empty. It opened its mouth, but the voice that came out was hollow, echoing. Make him stay with me forever. The air grew heavy, a cold wind howling through the clearing. The shadows shifted, faces forming in the mist twisted. Mournful faces, their mouths open in silent screams. May's face went pale, her body trembling. She took a step back, her voice shaking. Nietzsche, what's wrong with you? The figure's face twisted, its smile stretching unnaturally wide, eyes glowing with a sinister light. Its limbs elongated, its fingers stretching into skeletal claws. Nietzsche, May's voice broke, her body shaking. No, this isn't you. The figure's head jerked, its neck cracking, its smile widening. Its voice distorted, cold and hollow. Stay with me forever. The shadows surged forward, cold hands reaching out, skeletal fingers curling around May's body, pulling her down. She screamed, her voice echoing through the trees. Kin ran forward, his heart racing, his hand grabbing May's arm. But the shadows were cold, their grip unyielding, freezing his skin. May's eyes widened, her face pale, her body sinking into the ground, the shadows consuming her. Her voice was choked, desperate. Kin, help me. Kin pulled with all his strength, his hands burning with cold, his vision blurring. The shadows hissed, their faces twisting, eyes hollow and empty. The figure watched, its smile unmoving, its eyes glowing. Its voice was a whisper, soft and mournful, stay forever. Kin screamed, his voice breaking, his body trembling as the shadows pulled May deeper, her hands slipping from his grasp. Her eyes met his, wide and terrified, her mouth forming his name. Then she was gone, her body swallowed by the shadows, the earth closing over her, the clearing falling silent. Kin fell to his knees, his body cold, his chest heaving. Tears streamed down his face, his hands shaking. The figure's voice echoed through the trees, soft and sorrowful. Kin, don't leave me. He looked up, his vision blurred, the figure's glowing eyes fixed on him, its smile wide and cruel. The shadows moved, faces forming in the mist, their voices whispering his name. His heart froze, fear crawling up his spine. He was alone, alone with the shadows, alone with the whispers. The figure took a step forward, its movements smooth and unnatural, its voice echoing. Stay with me forever. The shadows closed in, the air growing colder, the darkness pressing in on him. Can's scream echoed through the forest, swallowed by the wind, and the clearing was silent once more. The clearing stood silent, the ancient shrine bathed in dim light as shadows twisted around the stone pillars. Ken knelt on the cold ground, his body shaking, his eyes fixed on the spot where May had vanished. The figure still stood before him, its elongated limbs swaying, its face shadowed, eyes glowing with cold light. Its smile was wide, unnatural, cruel. It took a step closer, its feet gliding above the earth, movements inhuman. The air grew colder, the shadows swirling around its form. Ken's body trembled, his heart racing, breath visible in the freezing mist. He wanted to run, to scream, but his body was frozen, his muscles locked in fear. The voice echoed, soft and mournful. Don't leave me, Ken. He choked back a sob, his eyes stinging with tears. The voice was wrong, hollow, but the words were familiar, the tone painfully recognizable. It sounded like Nietzsche. He squeezed his eyes shut, his fists clenching. You're not her. The figure tilted its head, its smile widening. Its voice grew softer, more sorrowful. You let me die, Ken. Why didn't you save me? Ken's chest tightened, his heart breaking. The memory of that night flooded back Nietzsche's pale face, her empty eyes, her body lying cold in the darkness. He shook his head, his voice cracking. No, it wasn't my fault. I tried to save you. The figure's eyes glowed brighter, its form flickering, shadows twisting around its body. It took another step forward, its voice echoing with pain. "You left me just like you left me." Can's breath caught in his throat, his body shaking. He looked down at his hands, the memory of May's fingers slipping from his grasp, her terrified eyes vanishing into the shadows. His stomach turned, guilt crushing his chest. He had failed them, both of them. The figure's body distorted, limbs stretching, its face twisting into a grotesque smile. It moved closer, its hollow eyes locked on him. Can stumbled back, his body trembling. Stay away." The shadows moved, swirling around his legs, cold hands brushing against his skin. Faces appeared in the mist, twisted, mournful faces with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. They whispered his name, voices echoing from all directions. Can you left us, you abandoned us." He pressed his hands over his ears, his voice cracking. Stop it." The whispers grew louder, the faces closing in, shadows tightening around his body. The figure stood over him, its eyes glowing, its smile wide and cruel. "You belong with us forever." The shadows surged forward, freezing cold enveloping him, skeletal hands wrapping around his arms, his legs, his neck. He struggled, but the cold was paralyzing, his body going numb. The whispers grew deafening, the faces twisting around him, eyes hollow and accusing. You left us to die." Can's vision blurred, his heart pounding. He felt himself sinking, the cold earth pulling him down, shadows wrapping around his body. He screamed, his voice echoing through the forest, but no one heard. No one came to help. He was alone. The figure's face was the last thing he saw, its glowing eyes fixed on him, its smile stretching impossibly wide. Its voice was a whisper, soft and mournful, "Stay forever." The shadows closed in, cold and suffocating, his body sinking into the earth, darkness enveloping him. And then there was nothing, only silence. The rescue team moved cautiously through the dense forest, their flashlights piercing the mist. They had been searching for days, but there was no sign of the missing hikers. Officer Samchai stood at the edge of the clearing, his face pale, eyes wide. Here they were, here. The ancient shrine stood before him, half buried in moss, the air cold and heavy. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle. Only an eerie silence, the shadows watching from the trees. A chill ran down his spine, a cold breeze whispering through the branches. He could have sworn he heard voices, soft and mournful, carried by the wind. Kinmei-nicha. His heart froze, his blood running cold. He looked around, but the forest was empty, the shadows still. He shivered, backing away. Let's get out of here." The team hurried back to the trail, the whispers fading into the distance, the shadows watching from the trees. In the clearing, the ancient shrine stood silent, the mist curling around its base. The air was cold, heavy, haunted. And if one listened closely, they could hear the voices, faint and sorrowful, echoing through the wind, "Stay forever." The abandoned camp. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows through the dense forest as the group of friends navigated the narrow trail. There were 5 of them: Nicha, the fearless leader with a knack for adventure; Tan, her boyfriend who loved photography; Beam, the group's joker; Fa, the quiet observer; and Nok, the skeptic who never believed in the supernatural. "This place is perfect," Nicha announced, pointing to a clearing nestled between ancient trees. The ground was flat, soft with fallen leaves, and a gentle breeze rustled through the canopy. As they set down their backpacks, Ten raised his camera, capturing the golden light filtering through the branches. "This is going to look amazing," he said, grinning as he reviewed the photos. Beam dropped his bag and stretched. "Finally, I thought my shoulders were going to fall off." Fa smiled, sitting on a fallen log and sipping water. Note glanced around, her eyes narrowing. "Are we sure we're the only ones here?" "I thought I saw something shiny through the trees," Nicha shrugged, brushing off Nock's concern. "Probably just some old cans or wrappers. We're not the first people to come hiking here." But as the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the forest in a dim amber glow, they noticed it just beyond the clearing, partially hidden by tall grass and creeping vines, was another campsite. The tents were intact, their bright colors faded from the sun, but still vibrant. A cooking pot rested on a makeshift stove, backpacks leaned against a fallen tree. Yet there was no sign of life, no voices, no movement, no footprints. The air grew heavy, cold despite the humid evening. Looks like someone left in a hurry, Beam commented, his playful demeanor fading as he examined the untouched setup. Who leaves their stuff behind like this? Tan snapped a photo, the flash illuminating the scene. Maybe they went for a hike and got lost. Noke crossed her arms, shivering despite the warm air. Then why did they leave the firewood stacked so neatly? It's like they planned to come back. Nietzsche took a step closer, her fingers brushing against the fabric of one of the tents. The material was dry, untouched by rain or dew. This hasn't been here long. Maybe a day or two. Fuzz's eyes widened as she pointed to the ground. Look, no footprints, nothing leading in or out. The realization settled over them, a cold chill creeping up their spines. How is that possible? Noke stammered, her voice unsteady. Did they vanish? The forest seemed to grow darker, the shadows stretching, bending toward the abandoned camp. A low whisper carried on the breeze, faint and haunting. Nietzsche turned abruptly. Let's go back to our spot. We'll figure this out in the morning. But as they made their way back to their own camp, a cold gust of wind swept through the trees, carrying with it the faint sound of laughter, distant, echoing, and undeniably human. Noke shivered, her eyes darting back to the empty tents. I don't think we're alone here. The sky darkened, the first stars peeking through the twilight. But as night settled over the forest, the abandoned camp remained untouched, waiting patiently for someone to return, or perhaps waiting for new visitors to stay. The night descended swiftly, enveloping the forest in darkness. Stars glittered faintly above, but the thick canopy blocked most of their light, leaving the campsite shrouded in shadows. The group huddled around a small campfire, its flickering flames casting eerie shapes on the surrounding trees. Nietzsche poked the fire with a stick, her expression tense. We'll check the abandoned camp again tomorrow. Maybe we'll find some clues in daylight. Yeah, right, Noke muttered, hugging her knees. If it's even still there by morning, Beam scoffed. You're being dramatic. It's just an old campsite. Maybe they got spooked by a bear or something and ran off. But no footprints. Fuzz's voice was barely above a whisper. Not even a trail. It's like they were never there. Silence settled over them, broken only by the crackling fire. Tan flipped through his camera, reviewing the photos he'd taken. He paused, his finger hovering over the screen. That's weird. Nietzsche leaned over. What is it? Tan's face paled as he turned the camera around. I don't remember anyone standing behind the tent when I took this. They leaned in closer, their faces illuminated by the faint light of the screen. In the photograph, just behind one of the faded tents, was a shadowy figure. Tall and indistinct, its body blurred as if caught mid-movement. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, watching them. Noke recoiled, her eyes wide. Is that a person? Beam laughed nervously. It's probably just a trick of the light. Tan shook his head. I took this with flash. There was nothing there when I clicked the photo. Nothing. A cold breeze rustled the leaves, and the flames flickered, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. The air grew colder, and an eerie silence followed, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, they heard it. A faint rustling sound, coming from the direction of the abandoned camp. It was slow, deliberate, like footsteps dragging across the forest floor. Fa grabbed Nietzsche's arm. Did you hear that? Nietzsche's face was pale, her eyes fixed on the darkness beyond their campsite. Yeah, and it's getting closer. The sound grew louder, accompanied by a soft whisper, carried by the wind. They couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, low, mournful, and haunting. Tan stood up, his flashlight shaking in his hand. I'll check it out. Nietzsche grabbed his arm. Are you crazy? We don't know what that is. He swallowed hard, forcing a grin. Probably just an animal. I'll be right back. Before anyone could stop him, he walked toward the noise, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. It almost sounded like voices pleading, crying. Tan's silhouette disappeared behind the trees, the light bobbing as he moved. The others waited, their breaths shallow, hearts racing. A scream shattered the silence. It was Tan. His flashlight fell to the ground, the beam spinning wildly before going out. The whispers stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. Nietzsche bolted upright. Tan, no response. She ran toward the trees, Beam and Fa close behind. Noke hesitated, fear paralyzing her, but she couldn't let her friends go alone. She forced her legs to move, following the others. They reached the spot where Tan had disappeared. His flashlight lay on the ground, still warm to the touch, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no struggle, nothing, just empty darkness. Beam's voice shook. Where did he go? Nich's eyes darted around, panic setting in. Tan, this isn't funny, come out. The forest responded with a whisper of voice that sounded exactly like Tan's. I'm here, come find me. It echoed from all directions, soft and hollow, distorted like a broken recording. Nich's blood ran cold. That's not him. The shadows seemed to stretch, twisting and writhing, taking on vague human shapes. One by one, they stepped forward, pale faces emerging from the darkness. Their eyes were hollow, mouths open in silent screams. Noak stumbled backward. We need to leave, now. But as they turned to run, the shadows moved, blocking their path. The faces became clearer, familiar. One of them looked just like Tan. His mouth opened, but the voice that came out was cold, devoid of life. Stay with us, the figures closed in, their ghostly hands reaching out, cold as death. And then, the fire at their campsite extinguished, plunging them into total darkness. Darkness engulfed them, thick and suffocating, as if the forest itself was alive, closing in. The shadows loomed closer, faces distorted in silent agony. Nich's heart pounded, her breath ragged. Run, we need to get back to the campsite. They stumbled through the undergrowth, branches clawing at their clothes, shadows chasing at their heels. Nock's flashlight flickered, barely piercing the darkness. The whispers followed, twisted echoes of Tan's voice calling from all directions. Stay with us forever. Beam stumbled, nearly falling. Fa grabbed his arm, pulling him upright. Come on, don't look back. They burst through the trees, collapsing at their campsite. The fire was out, leaving only smoke curling into the cold night air. Their belongings were scattered, tents torn open, as if something had ransacked the place. Nich's voice trembled. What did this? No one answered. They all knew whatever was haunting the abandoned camp had followed them. Nock's face was pale, tears streaming down. We need to leave, now. But Tanfo's voice broke, eyes glancing back toward the darkness. We can't just leave him out there. Nicha clenched her fists, guilt gnawing at her. He's gone. Whatever that thing was, it took him. Beam's eyes widened. No, I don't believe it. He's out there, lost. We need to find him. A rustling sound came from behind the torn tent. They froze, staring as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Tan. His face was pale, eyes dull and vacant. He moved stiffly, as if his body was being pulled on invisible strings. His mouth opened, but the voice that came out was hollow, echoing. Why did you leave me? Noak screamed, stumbling back. Tan. He stepped closer, movements unnatural, his head tilted to the side, a sickening crack echoing through the clearing. You said we'd be together forever. Nich's heart raced, tears in her eyes. No, that's not him. It's pretending to be him. Beam shook his head, disbelief twisting his features. No, it's Tan, he's alive. He ran toward the figure. Tan, we're here. Noak reached out to stop him, but he was already too far. Beam, no. Beam embraced the figure, sobbing. I thought you were gone. The figure's face twisted into a cruel smile, eyes turning hollow and black. Its arms wrapped around Beam, tightening, pulling him closer. Beam's face contorted in pain. Why, you're hurting me, Tan, stop. The creature's mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It leaned in, whispering into Beam's ear with a voice that was not human. Stay with us forever. A shadow engulfed them both. Beam's scream echoed through the forest, then abruptly cut off. The figure stood alone, its body contorting, limbs stretching into unnatural angles before it melted back into the darkness. Fa collapsed to her knees, sobbing. Beam, no, this can't be happening. Nicha grabbed her arm, pulling her up. We need to go, now. Noak was shaking, eyes wide with terror. What is it? What does it want? Nicha's voice was hollow, a cold realization sinking in. It wants us, all of us, just like it took them. Fa's eyes widened. Them, you mean the campers who were here before? Nicha nodded, her voice trembling. That's why there were no footprints. No signs of struggle. They were consumed, taken by whatever that thing is. The forest grew colder, shadows shifting around them. The whispers returned, echoing through the trees. Voices they recognized. Tan's laugh, Beam's playful taunts, familiar and haunting. They turned toward the path leading out of the forest, only to see the shadows blocking their way, faces emerging from the darkness. Twisted, distorted versions of Tan and Beam stared back at them, their mouths moving in unison. "Stay with us forever," the shadows surged forward. Nietzsche screamed, grabbing Noak and Fa. "Run." They sprinted into the forest, branches tearing at their skin, shadows following, voices whispering their names. The darkness seemed alive, shifting and twisting, leading them in circles. Fa tripped, falling hard. Noak pulled her up, panic in her eyes. "Get up, we can't stop." The shadows surrounded them, faces they knew, voices they loved. Tan, Beam, smiling, welcoming. Stay with us." Nietzsche looked back, her heart shattering. We have to keep going," they ran, tears blurring their vision, the darkness pressing in. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Shadows danced around them, reaching out with cold, skeletal hands. The trees began to thin, the faint light of dawn breaking through. The exit was just ahead. But as they reached the edge of the forest, the shadows lunged, cold hands grabbing at their ankles, pulling them back. Nietzsche screamed, thrashing, fighting to break free. "No, we're almost there." Noak and Fa grabbed her arms, pulling with all their strength. "We won't leave you, not like Tan and Beam." With one final effort, they broke free, stumbling out of the forest and collapsing on the dirt road. The shadows stopped at the tree line, faces twisted in rage, mouths open in silent screams. The voices faded, the whispers growing faint. The forest returned to its eerie silence, as if nothing had ever happened, but the faces remained, watching them, waiting. Nietzsche looked back one last time, her heart aching as she saw Tan and Beam standing among the shadows, their eyes hollow, faces frozen in silent pleas. Then they turned and disappeared into the darkness. Nietzsche, Noak, and Fa sat on the road, gasping for air, tears streaming down their faces. They were alive, but they knew a part of them would always remain in that cursed forest, and the shadows would be waiting for the next group to wander too close. The sun began to rise, its golden light cutting through the fog that clung to the forest's edge. Nietzsche, Noak, and Fa sat huddled on the dirt road, exhausted and shaken, their eyes fixed on the tree line. The shadows were gone, but the eerie silence remained, heavy and ominous. Fa's voice was barely a whisper. We made it out." Noak was trembling, her eyes distant. "But we left them," Tan Beam. Nietzsche's heart twisted painfully. The memories of their laughter, their friendship, flashed before her eyes. She squeezed her fists, nails digging into her palms. They're gone. Whatever that thing was, it took them. Just like the campers before us." Fa choked back a sob, hugging her knees. "We should have known, we should have left when we saw that abandoned camp." The forest remained silent, as if listening. Watching and OK single quotes S face was pale, her eyes hollow. "We'll never be free of this of them, I can still hear them, their voices." Nietzsche's blood ran cold. What do you mean?" Noak's head turned slowly, eyes wide and fearful. "They're calling from the shadows, I hear Tan calling my name." A chill ran down Nietzsche's spine. She listened, her breath hitching. Faintly, carried by the morning breeze, she heard it. A whisper, soft and mournful. "Noak, Nietzsche, Fa, come back." Nietzsche's heart raced, her body frozen. It was Tan's voice. It was Beam's voice. Clear as day, echoing from the trees. Fa's face went pale, her lips trembling. No, this isn't real, this can't be real." Nietzsche forced herself to her feet, grabbing Fa and Noak. "We can't stay here. We have to go. Now." They stumbled down the road, away from the forest. But the whispers followed, weaving through the trees, growing louder. "Don't leave us, stay forever," Noak sobbed, covering her ears. Stop, make it stop." They kept running, feet pounding the dirt, hearts racing. The road twisted through the mountains, the forest looming on either side. But no matter how far they ran, the whispers followed, persistent and haunting. It was late afternoon when they finally saw another human, a park ranger patrolling the road. Relief washed over them, and they ran toward him, tears streaming down their faces. "Please help us, our friends, they're gone," Nietzsche choked out, her voice shaking. The ranger's face grew serious, his eyes shifting toward the forest. "You were camping up there, near the abandoned site?" Noak nodded, her body trembling. "Yes, we didn't know about the voices." The ranger's face darkened, his expression grim. "You're not the first. People disappear up there. Campers, hikers, locals say the spirits don't let them leave. Fuz's voice was frantic. But we got out, we survived. The ranger looked at them, his eyes sorrowful. Did you? Are you sure? Nietzsche's heart sank, confusion flooding her. What do you mean? He pointed to the dirt road behind them. There were no footprints. No sign that they had ever walked down the road. Fuz's knees buckled, her face paling. No, that's not possible. We ran all the way here. The whispers grew louder, swirling around them. Tan's voice, Beam's voice, and other voices, dozens of them, lost and pleading. Stay with us forever, Noak screamed, clutching her head. No, leave us alone. The ranger took a step back, his face shadowed. You can't leave. Not once you've heard their call. His body began to fade, his figure growing transparent. His eyes were hollow, his mouth moving in sync with the whispers. You belong to them now, just like the rest of us. The world shifted, the dirt road faded, the sunlight dimming. Trees surrounded them once more, shadows stretching toward them. Nietzsche's chest tightened, panic clawing at her. No, we got out, we were free. Fuz's scream echoed through the forest as the shadows wrapped around her, cold hands pulling her into the darkness. Nietzsche, Noak, help me. Don't let them take me. Noak tried to run, but her feet wouldn't move. Shadows coiled around her legs, pulling her down. Her face twisted in horror, tears streaming down. Nietzsche, I don't want to stay here. I don't want to die. Nietzsche reached out, her fingers brushing knocks before the shadows swallowed her whole. Alone, surrounded by the darkness, Nietzsche fell to her knees. The whispers were everywhere, growing louder, echoing with laughter and screams. Faces formed in the shadows, distorted and twisted. Tan, Beam, Noak, Fa, and countless others. They smiled at her, their voices blending together. Stay forever. The shadows closed in, cold and suffocating. Nietzsche's scream was swallowed by the darkness, her body sinking into the earth, leaving no trace behind. The forest grew silent once more, as if nothing had happened. The abandoned campsite lay waiting, untouched, undisturbed. And from the shadows, voices echoed, waiting for the next group of campers to wander too close. Scratches on the tent. The sun was setting behind the lush green mountains of northern Thailand, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. For friends Ploy, Min, Tui, and Golf were busy setting up their tents in a secluded clearing by the edge of the dense forest. It was the perfect spot, or so they thought. This place is beautiful, Min sighed, admiring the view. We picked the perfect weekend to get away from the city. Tui grinned as he hammered the last tent peg into the ground. Yeah, no cell service, no noise, just us and nature. Golf threw a few more logs onto the fire pit. I heard the locals say this area is untouched. Hardly anyone comes here to camp. Ploy looked around, her eyes scanning the towering trees that surrounded them. The forest was dense, the shadows growing longer as the sun sank lower. I wonder why it's so peaceful. As night fell, they gathered around the campfire, laughing and sharing stories. The flames danced, casting flickering shadows on their faces. But as the laughter echoed into the darkness, a cold breeze rustled through the trees, sending chills down Ploy's spine. She shivered and scooted closer to the fire. Did anyone else feel that? She asked, rubbing her arms. Tui shrugged. It's probably just the mountain wine. It gets cold up here at night. Golf took a long sip from his water bottle. Or maybe it's the spirits of the forest, checking out their visitors. He wiggled his fingers, imitating ghostly movements. Min rolled her eyes. Cut it out, Golf. You're just trying to scare us. Golf laughed. Just trying to set the mood. Ploy frowned, glancing at the dark tree line. The shadows seemed to shift, as if something was watching them from the depths of the forest. She shook her head, brushing off the uneasy feeling. It was just her imagination, or at least, that's what she told herself. The fire crackled, sending sparks up into the starry sky. They talked and laughed late into the night, finally retreating to their tents as the fire died down to glowing embers. The forest was silent, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of an owl. But as sleep wrapped around them, the darkness began to move. Shadows danced around the tents, silent and unseen. A faint scratching sound echoed through the night. It was soft at first, almost unnoticeable, but then it grew louder, a clawing noise that moved along the fabric of the tents. slow, deliberate, as if something was testing the barrier between the campers and the outside world. Ploy stirred in her sleeping bag, her eyes fluttering open. She listened, her heart pounding as the scratching continued, circling the tent, her breath caught in her throat. It sounded too deliberate to be a tree branch, too eerie to be an animal. She held her breath, her body frozen with fear. But just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. Silence fell once more, heavy and oppressive. Ploy waited, her heart racing, but nothing else happened. She let out a shaky breath, convincing herself it was just her imagination. She closed her eyes, eventually drifting back to sleep. Morning came, bright and warm. The sunlight filtered through the trees, birds singing cheerfully. Ploy crawled out of her tent, stretching and yawning. But as she turned to face her tent, her blood ran cold. Long, deep scratches covered the side of the tent, jagged and uneven, as if made by sharp claws. The fabric was torn in several places, the marks crisscrossing wildly. What did this? Ploy whispered, her voice trembling. Min walked over, her face going pale. That's not from any animal I know of. Tui's expression darkened. There aren't supposed to be any big predators around here. No bears, no tigers. Golf looked around, his eyes narrowing. Then what made those scratches? A cold wind blew through the campsite, rustling the leaves. The forest seemed to close in around them, shadows lingering at the edge of the clearing. Ploy shivered, her gaze fixed on the scratches. Deep down, she knew that whatever made them was still out there watching, waiting, and night would come again. The group huddled around the scratched tent, their faces pale with fear and confusion. The deep, jagged marks were unmistakably deliberate, as if something had tried to claw its way in. Ploy's voice shook as she spoke. We didn't hear anything. How could something do this without waking us up? Min looked around nervously, her eyes darting to the dense forest surrounding them. Maybe it happened before we went to sleep. Tui shook his head. No way. We were by the fire the whole time. We would have seen something. Golf's face grew serious. If it wasn't an animal, then what was it? A heavy silence fell over them as they glanced at each other, uncertainty in their eyes. The morning sun was warm, but the air felt cold, heavy with an unseen presence. I think we should leave, Ploy whispered, her voice barely audible. Whatever did this, I don't think it wants us here. Golf hesitated, glancing at the surrounding trees. But we just got here. We were supposed to camp for 2 more nights. Min looked at him, her face pale. Do you really want to stay after seeing this? Golf opened his mouth to argue but fell silent as a cold breeze rustled through the trees. It carried with it a faint whisper, a voice so soft it was almost imperceptible. They froze, eyes wide as they listened. The whisper seemed to drift around them, echoing through the air. It was faint, like a breath carried on the wind. But it was unmistakably human. Ploy's heart pounded. Did you hear that? Tui nodded, his face tense. Yeah, it sounded like someone whispering. Golf scanned the tree line, his voice low. Who would be out here? We're miles from the nearest village. Min hugged herself, her shoulders trembling. I don't like this. Let's pack up and go. Now. They moved quickly, dismantling the tent's intense silence. But the forest seemed to be watching them. The air was heavy, the shadows long and twisted. As they hurried to pack, Ploy noticed something out of the corner of her eye. A white shape, just at the edge of the clearing, barely visible between the trees. It was there for only a moment before disappearing into the shadows. She gasped, dropping her sleeping bag. Did you see that? Min turned, her eyes wide. See what? Ploy pointed to the spot. There was something there, something white. Tui frowned, his gaze fixed on the tree line. I don't see anything, are you sure? Ploy nodded, her hands shaking. I saw it. Just for a second it was watching us. Golf cursed under his breath, his face pale. This place is creeping me out. Let's get out of here. They finished packing in record time, the eerie feeling growing stronger with every passing minute. But as they turned to leave, the whisper came again, drifting through the air like a sigh. It was louder this time, clearer. It sounded like a voice calling their names. Min's face went white. No, that's impossible. No one knows we're here. The whisper grew stronger, echoing through the trees. It was soft, almost gentle, but the malice behind it was unmistakable. Ploy grabbed Min's arm. Run, now. They didn't look back as they fled down the narrow trail, the whisper following them. Growing louder, closer, the forest seemed to close in around them. the trees twisting and bending, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Shadows danced at the corners of their vision, fleeting shapes that vanished when they looked directly at them. The whisper echoed through the trees, relentless and haunting. It was no longer a single voice. It was many overlapping, calling their names over and over again. Chloe's heart raced as she ran, her lungs burning. But no matter how fast they moved, the voices followed, surrounding them, whispering in their ears. The forest was alive, the air thick with malice. And as the shadows closed in, they realized they were no longer alone. Something was out there, watching them, hunting them. And it wasn't going to let them leave. Branches snapped beneath their feet as they ran, their breaths ragged and panicked. The trees seemed to close in tighter with every step, the shadows twisting unnaturally, forming faces that watched them with hollow eyes. Chloe was at the front, her heart pounding as she pushed through the undergrowth. "We have to keep moving, don't look back." But Min couldn't help herself. She glanced over her shoulder and saw them white shapes flitting between the trees, moving too fast to be human. Their faces were featureless, pale masks in the darkness, their limbs bending at unnatural angles. She choked back a scream. "They're following us." Golf's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What are they, spirits? Ghosts?" Tui shook his head, his voice trembling. "I don't know, but they're not human." The whispers grew louder, circling them, echoing through the trees. Their names were called out in soft, chilling voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Chloe's legs burned as she ran, but the trail was changing. The path they had taken to get here was gone, replaced by twisted vines and gnarled roots. This isn't the way back." Min looked around frantically. "What do you mean?" "This is the trail, isn't it?" Tui's voice was strained. "No, it's changed. The forest is different, it's like it's trying to trap us." Chloe stopped, her chest heaving. "This isn't natural, it's like the forest is alive." The others gathered around her, their faces pale and fearful. The trees loomed above them, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers. The shadows seemed to pulse, moving closer. Golf's voice was a hoarse whisper. "How do we get out?" Before anyone could answer, a cold wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the sound of laughter, childlike, playful, but with a sinister edge. Min's eyes widened. "Who's there?" No answer came, only the sound of rustling leaves and the faint, echoing giggle. Chloe turned in a circle, her eyes scanning the shadows. "We need to keep moving. If we stand still, they'll catch us." But as they took a step forward, the ground shifted beneath them. Roots coiled around their ankles, pulling them down. Min screamed, struggling against the vines that tightened like snakes. "No, let go." Tui hacked at the vines with his pocket knife, his hands shaking. "This isn't possible, plants don't move like this." The whispers grew louder, the voices overlapping, distorting. The words were no longer recognizable, but the malice was clear. Golf broke free, yanking Min out of the tangled roots. "This way, we have to find the river. If we follow the water, it'll lead us out." They stumbled forward, the ground shifting beneath their feet. The forest twisted around them, the trees bending and creaking, their bark splitting to reveal hollow faces that watched with empty eyes. Chloe's heart raced as she ran, the shadows moving with them, always just out of sight. But as they reached a clearing, she skidded to a stop. There, in the center of the clearing, was their campsite. The tent stood exactly as they had left it, the scratches still carved deep into the fabric. But the air was cold, unnaturally so, and the shadows seemed to breathe, pulsing in and out. Min's voice was a shaky whisper. How are we back here? We were running away, we didn't turn around." Tui looked around in horror. "It's like we're walking in circles, like the forest won't let us leave." Golf's fists clenched. No, this isn't happening. There's got to be a way out." But before they could move, the air grew heavy. The temperature dropped sharply, their breaths visible in the freezing air. And then they heard it, a low, guttural growl, echoing from the trees. It was deep, inhuman, filled with hunger. Chloe took a step back. What is that?" The shadows shifted, pulling away from the trees, coalescing into a shape, a figure hunched and twisted, its limbs long and skeletal, its face hidden beneath a tattered hood. The creature's eyes gleamed, burning with a malevolent light. It moved with unnatural grace, its body distorting, bending in impossible ways. Min's voice was barely a whisper. It's the thing that made the scratches." The creature let out another growl, its mouth splitting into a wide, jagged grin. It stepped forward, the shadows swirling around it, its body flickering in and out of existence. Golf took a step back, his voice trembling. We have to run, now. But as they turned to flee, the shadows moved, blocking their path. The trees twisted, their branches forming a cage, trapping them in the clearing. The creature's laughter echoed through the air, a cruel, mocking sound that sent chills down their spines. Chloe's heart raced, her eyes wide with terror. They were trapped, surrounded by shadows, the creature closing in, and there was no way out. The creature's twisted form loomed over them, its eyes burning with a sinister light. Shadows coiled around its skeletal limbs, writhing like living snakes. Its jagged grin stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. Chloe's body trembled as she backed away, her mind racing. This can't be real, it's just a nightmare, it has to be. But the cold air biting at her skin and the shadows crawling closer were all too real. Tui clutched his pocket knife tightly, his hands shaking. Stay back, stay away from us. He swung the blade, but it passed through the creature's body as if cutting through smoke. The creature laughed, a deep, guttural sound that made their blood run cold. It moved closer, its limbs bending at unnatural angles, its head tilting to the side in a disturbingly childlike curiosity. Golf's voice was barely audible. It's not human, it was never human. The shadows closed in, their whispering voices growing louder, echoing the names of the group with a mocking, taunting tone. Min covered her ears, tears streaming down her face. Stop it, stop saying my name. Chloe grabbed her shoulder, pulling her close. We need to get out of here, we can't stay in this place. But the forest had other plans. The trees shifted, their branches curling inward, forming a cage around the clearing. The shadows pulsed, throbbing like a heartbeat, their darkness deepening. The creature's eyes flicked toward the tent, where the deep scratches were still carved into the fabric. It pointed one long, skeletal finger, its mouth moving without sound. But the message was clear, it was marking its territory. This place, it's cursed, Tui whispered, his face pale. It's been watching us from the start, it never intended to let us leave. Chloe's eyes widened. The scratches, it was warning us, or maybe claiming us. The creature's grin widened, its body distorting, flickering in and out of existence. The shadows stretched, reaching for them, their cold touch brushing against their skin. Golf's eyes darted around. We can't stay here. We need to break through the trees. They ran as one, charging at the wall of branches. Tui slashed at the vines with his knife, his voice desperate. Move, we can't let it trap us. The branches resisted, bending but refusing to break. The shadows hissed, tightening around their ankles, pulling them back. Min screamed, her body jerking as she was dragged across the ground. Help me, it's pulling me in. Golf grabbed her arms, pulling with all his strength. I've got you, I won't let go. The creature watched with amusement, its form flickering like a dying flame. It moved closer, the shadows dancing around its body, merging with the darkness of the forest. Chloe's voice shook. It's playing with us, it enjoys watching us suffer. The laughter echoed again, cold and hollow, reverberating through the clearing. The air grew colder, their breaths visible in the freezing mist. Tui's knife finally cut through the last vine, and they stumbled out of the circle of trees, their bodies aching. But the forest didn't end, it twisted and spiraled around them, the path changing with every step. It's like a maze, it won't let us leave. Min sobbed, her legs shaking. Chloe grabbed her hand, her eyes fierce. We keep moving, no matter what, we keep moving. They ran blindly, the shadows chasing them, the creature's laughter echoing behind. The trees stretched into the sky, their branches curling inward, blocking out the moonlight. They burst into another clearing and froze. Their campsite stood before them, the tent untouched, the scratches gleaming in the pale light. It was exactly as they had left it. Volf's voice cracked. No, we ran straight, we didn't turn back. Min collapsed to her knees. It's hopeless, we're trapped, we'll never leave. The creature appeared beside the tent, its body flickering, its hollow eyes gleaming. It lifted one hand, its long fingers tracing the scratches on the tent fabric, its mouth curling into that cruel, mocking grin. Chloe's breath caught in her throat. It was always here, watching us, waiting for us to break. The shadows surged forward, engulfing them. Cold tendrils wrapped around their bodies, tightening, pulling them down. Their screams were swallowed by the darkness, echoing into nothingness. 2 days later, the rescue team found the campsite. The tent was intact, surrounded by the dense forest. untouched and undisturbed. But there was no sign of Ploy, Tui, Golf, or Min. The leader of the team frowned, kneeling beside the tent. "It's strange there are no footprints. It's like they just vanished." His partner pointed to the tent's fabric, his face pale. "Look at this deep, jagged scratches were carved into the tent's side, long claw marks that tore through the material." The team leader ran his fingers over them, his voice shaking. What could have made these? A cold wind blew through the clearing, carrying with it a faint whisper. The rescuers turned, scanning the trees, but found nothing but shadows. They packed up the tent, marking the site for investigation. But as they left the clearing, the shadows seemed to move, curling around the trees, watching with hollow eyes. And deep within the forest, echoing through the darkness, came a low, chilling laughter. The creature's jagged grin gleamed in the shadows, its body flickering before melting back into the darkness, leaving nothing but the cold wind and the whisper of names that would never be answered. The shadow by the campfire. In the heart of Thailand's dense jungle, where ancient trees whispered secrets to the night sky, a group of friends gathered around a crackling campfire. The golden flames danced, casting flickering shadows against the gnarled tree trunks, creating a surreal play of light and darkness. They were far from civilization, surrounded by the haunting beauty of the wilderness. It was supposed to be an unforgettable adventure, one last escape before they graduated and faced the realities of adulthood. Laughter echoed as they shared stories and roasted marshmallows, feeling a sense of freedom that only the deep forest could provide. But as the night grew darker and the flames began to wane, they would realize they were not alone. Something was watching from the shadows, lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. And it was waiting for the perfect moment to reveal itself. The campsite was nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering bamboo groves and ancient trees whose twisted branches formed eerie silhouettes against the moonlit sky. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Above, the stars twinkled faintly, barely visible through the canopy. The campfire's light flickered, illuminating their faces in shades of gold and amber. Shadows danced wildly on the trees, shifting with each crackle and pop of the firewood. It was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic the way the shadows moved, twisting and contorting like living creatures. Chloe shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "It's getting colder. Didn't the guide say it's unusually chilly in this part of the forest?" Golf poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of embers into the air. "Yeah, he did. Something about old spirits lingering in the woods." Tui laughed, his voice echoing into the darkness. "Oh, come on. You don't believe that nonsense, do you?" Ploy looked around nervously. "I don't know, this place feels different. Like we're being watched." The wind rustled through the leaves, whispering softly as if responding to her words. It sent a chill down their spines. Min leaned in closer, her eyes gleaming mischievously. "You know, there's an old legend about these woods. They say that shadows here aren't just tricks of the light. They're spirits, lost souls who can't find their way out of the forest." Tui rolled his eyes. "Here we go, another ghost story." Min ignored him, her voice lowering to a whisper. "They say that if you stare at the shadows long enough, they start to look back at you. And if you see one that doesn't move with the fire, that's not a shadow. It's one of them watching you, waiting." A heavy silence fell over the group, the only sound being the crackling of the fire. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches creaking like old bones. Ploy's eyes darted around nervously. "Stop it, Min. You're creeping me out." Golf chuckled, but his laughter was uneasy. "It's just a story, right?" Min's face was serious. "I heard it from my grandmother. She said if you see the shadow and acknowledge it, it follows you home." The fire sputtered, its light dimming for a moment before flaring up again. In that brief darkness, Tui swore he saw a figure standing just beyond the trees, a tall, slender silhouette with hollow eyes staring back at him. He blinked, and it was gone. His heart raced, but he forced a laugh. "Nice story, Min. You almost got me," Min smirked. "Who said it was just a story?" A cold breeze swept through the clearing, making the flames shiver. The shadows on the trees grew longer, their shapes distorting, bending in unnatural ways. Tui's eyes lingered on the darkness beyond the firelight. He could have sworn he saw something move, just a flicker, a flash of pale light in the corner of his eye. But when he turned to look, there was nothing there, nothing at all. The laughter faded, and an uneasy silence settled over them. Ploy moved closer to the fire, her eyes fixed on the trees. Maybe we should go to bed. It's late, Tui nodded, his bravado from earlier fading. Yeah, good idea. They extinguished the fire, watching as the light flickered and died, leaving only glowing embers. Darkness rushed in, enveloping the campsite. Golf turned on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the shadows. All right, everyone to your tents. We've got a long hike tomorrow. As they retreated to their tents, the forest seemed to breathe around them, the leaves rustling in a rhythmic whisper. Tui hesitated, his eyes scanning the tree line one last time. He saw it. A shadow tall and thin standing perfectly still. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, its eyes glowing faintly in the dark. His breath caught in his throat. He took a step back, stumbling over a root. When he looked up again, the shadow was gone. The wind howled softly, carrying with it a whisper. A voice he didn't recognize, calling his name from the darkness. Tui's body went cold. He ran to his tent, zipping it shut as fast as his shaking hands would allow. But the whisper continued, floating just outside the thin fabric. His name, repeated softly, over and over again. He curled up in his sleeping bag, covering his ears, trying to block out the sound. But the voice grew louder, more insistent, as if it were right outside his tent, calling for him. Morning arrived with pale sunlight filtering through the dense canopy. Birds chirped softly, the forest waking from its nocturnal slumber. But the campsite felt cold, unnaturally so. Tui emerged from his tent, his face pale and eyes sunken with exhaustion. He hadn't slept. The whispering had continued all night, fading only as the first light of dawn touched the trees. He looked around nervously, his gaze lingering on the spot where he had seen the shadow. But in the morning light, the forest looked normal, peaceful even. Ploy approached, concern evident in her eyes. Are you okay? You look terrible. Tui forced a laugh. Just didn't sleep well. This place is creepy at night. Golf yawned as he stepped out of his tent. Tell me about it. I kept hearing weird noises like someone walking around the camp. Min joined them, her face serious. I heard it too. Thought it was one of you going to the bathroom. They exchanged uneasy glances. None of them had left their tents. Tui hesitated, his heart racing. Should he tell them about the shadow, about the whisper calling his name? He opened his mouth but stopped himself. It sounded crazy. Just a bad dream, he convinced himself. Let's pack up and keep moving, Golf suggested, trying to shake off the eerie feeling. The sooner we get out of this place, the better, they agreed, quickly packing their gear. But as Tui rolled up his sleeping bag, he froze. Scratched into the dirt outside his tent were long, thin lines like claw marks. His blood ran cold. He hadn't noticed them last night. They were deep, deliberate, circling his tent in strange patterns. He glanced at the others. Hey, did you guys see these? Min frowned, kneeling to examine the marks. What the hell made these? They're too big for any animal around here. Ploy shivered, stepping back. I don't like this, let's get out of here. Golf tried to sound brave, probably just some wild boar or something. Come on, let's move. But they all knew the truth. There were no animals nearby, not even birdsong. The forest was deathly silent, as if holding its breath. They hiked deeper into the woods, the air growing colder the further they went. Shadows danced between the trees, shifting and twisting unnaturally. Tui couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, the hairs on his neck standing on end. As they trekked through the dense undergrowth, Min spoke up, her voice low. I remember another story my grandmother told me about spirits in the forest. They call them pitam, or the following shadows. Ploy looked at her, eyes wide. What are they? Min's expression darkened. They're spirits of those who were lost in the woods, people who never found their way out. They say they're jealous of the living, and they follow travelers, waiting for them to get lost so they can take their place and leave the forest. Golf scoffed, but his voice wavered. That's just a story. Min's eyes were solemn. My grandmother swore it was true. She said the shadows are always there, watching. And if they call your name, you must never answer. If you do, they'll follow you forever. Tui's heart skipped a beat. He remembered the whisper from last night, soft, insistent, calling his name. He shuddered, staying silent as they continued walking. The forest grew denser, the light dimming as thick branches intertwined overhead. Shadows pulled beneath the trees, dark and motionless. Yet, every time Tui looked away, he saw them shift, just at the edge of his vision. Ploy stumbled, her foot catching on a root. As Golf helped her up, they both froze. Imprinted in the soft earth was a footprint long and narrow, with toes stretched impossibly far apart. What made that? Ploy's voice trembled. Golf's face went pale. I don't know. The footprint was fresh, pointing towards the direction they were heading. Yet, there were no other tracks leading to or away from it. Just a single, solitary print. Min's voice quivered. It's facing us like it was waiting. A cold gust of wind rushed through the trees, whispering softly. The leaves rustled, forming words in the air. Tui heard it clearly this time, his name, drawn out in a long, mournful wail. His knees buckled, fear gripping his heart. Did you hear that? They looked at him, confused. Hear what? Golf asked, his voice tinged with fear. Tui's eyes darted around, searching the shadows. But the forest was silent once more. Min grabbed his arm. Tui, you're scaring me. What's wrong? He swallowed hard. Nothing, I'm just tired. But the whisper echoed in his mind, chilling him to his core. It knew his name. It was calling for him. They continued walking, their pace quickening as the forest seemed to close in around them. Shadows followed at a distance, their shapes shifting, growing taller, their hollow eyes fixed on Tui. He felt them getting closer, their cold presence brushing against his back. He refused to look, knowing that if he acknowledged them, they would grow stronger. The whisper grew louder, more desperate. His name, repeated over and over again. A plea, a command, a curse. He covered his ears, but the voice was inside his head now, echoing through his thoughts. It wouldn't stop. It wouldn't let him go. And deep within the shadows, something smiled. The forest felt alive. The air was heavy, pressing down on them as they moved through the dense undergrowth. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig echoed ominously, making them flinch. Tui lagged behind, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. They were closer now, shifting just out of sight. He could feel their cold gaze, hear the whispering call his name, spoken in a voice so familiar, yet distorted, echoing through the trees. Tui, he froze, his heart hammering. It was his mother's voice, soft and gentle, just like he remembered. Tui, come here. His body moved on its own, his feet dragging him toward the darkness. He took a step, then another, his eyes glazed as the shadows reached out, curling around him like tendrils of smoke. Tui. Golf's shout shattered the spell. Tui stumbled back, shaking his head as the shadows recoiled, melting into the trees. He looked at his friends, their faces pale with fear. What the hell are you doing? Golf demanded, grabbing his arm. You were walking right into the woods. Tui opened his mouth, but no words came out. How could he explain that he had heard his mother's voice, that he had almost followed it, willingly? Ploy's eyes were wide, her face ashen. This place is cursed, we need to leave. Now. They hurried on, but the forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees closing in around them. The path they had marked was gone, swallowed by the dense undergrowth. No matter which direction they turned, they ended up back in the same clearing, surrounded by gnarled trees that seemed to leer at them. Min's voice broke, trembling. We're lost. Golf shook his head, panic flickering in his eyes. That's impossible. We followed the trail exactly, but the truth was undeniable. They were trapped, caught in a labyrinth of shadows and whispers. They sat in the clearing, the air growing colder as the sun sank behind the trees. Darkness crept in, bringing with it an unnatural chill. Min hugged her knees, her voice small. My grandmother said the Pitam will follow you until you get lost. Once you can't find your way out, they surround you and you become one of them. Ploy's face paled. You mean we'll become shadows? Min nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. They say the forest is full of them, shadows of people who never escaped. They walk the woods forever, calling out to the living, trying to take their place. Tui shivered, the whisper echoing in his mind. If he had followed it, would he have become one of them? Golf clenched his fists. No, I'm not staying here another night. We'll find a way out. But as they stood to leave, a cold breeze swept through the clearing, carrying with it a chorus of whispers. Their names, repeated over and over, rising and falling like a haunting melody. Tui's blood ran cold. It wasn't just one voice anymore. It was many men, women, children, all calling out to them. He looked around, his heart pounding. Shadows gathered at the edge of the clearing, their hollow eyes gleaming. They stood still, silent, watching. Ploy backed away, her face pale. They're everywhere. The shadows moved as one, stepping closer. Their faces were blank, features stretched into unnatural shapes. But their eyes were fixed on Tui, unblinking, hungry. Tui, come with us. His knees buckled, his body trembling as the shadows reached out, their arms elongating, fingers twisting into claws. Golf grabbed his shoulder, pulling him back. Run. They ran, crashing through the undergrowth, branches whipping at their faces. The shadows followed, gliding soundlessly, their whispers echoing through the trees. Tui, don't leave us. He covered his ears, but the voices grew louder, more desperate. They were so close, their cold breath brushing against his neck. Min stumbled, falling hard. Tui stopped, reaching out to help her, but before he could move, the shadows surged forward, enveloping her. She screamed, her body convulsing as the shadows wrapped around her, seeping into her skin. Her eyes turned black, her face twisting into a mask of agony. Then she fell silent, her body limp as the shadows retreated, leaving her lying still on the forest floor. Ploy sobbed, covering her mouth. Min, no. Golf pulled Tui away, his voice shaking. We have to go now. Tui looked back, his heart breaking as Min's body began to twitch. She rose slowly, her movements jerky, unnatural. Her head tilted, her hollow eyes locking onto his. A twisted smile spread across her face. Tui, stay with me. It wasn't Min's voice anymore. It was hollow, echoing, the voice of the shadows. Tui choked back a sob, his feet moving on their own as he ran. He didn't look back, even as Min's laughter followed him, cold and mocking. The forest seemed to close in around them, the path twisting and turning, leading them in circles. Shadows flickered at the edge of his vision, their eyes gleaming with malice. Tui's legs burned, his lungs aching. But he couldn't stop. Not while the shadows were chasing them. Not while Min's hollow laughter echoed through the trees. They ran until they couldn't run anymore, collapsing in a small clearing, gasping for breath. But the shadows were still there, lurking just out of sight, waiting. Golf's face was pale, his hands trembling. We can't get out, they're not letting us leave. Tui looked at the shadows, their faces distorted, inhuman. They smiled, their voices blending into one. Tui, stay with us forever. His blood turned to ice as he realized the truth. They didn't want to kill him. They wanted him to join them, to become one of them. The shadows circled the clearing, their faces twisted into grotesque smiles, eyes hollow and unblinking. Their whispers grew louder, echoing off the trees, calling out to them. Tui, Golf, Ploy, stay with us forever. Ploy was sobbing, her body trembling as she backed away, pressing herself against a tree. Golf stood in front of her, fists clenched, his face pale but determined. Tui's heart pounded, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way out. He looked at Min, or what was once Min, standing among the shadows, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her eyes pitch black, devoid of life. Her mouth moved, stretching into an eerie grin. Tui, don't leave me, we're friends, aren't we? Her voice was distorted, hollow, echoing as if spoken from deep within a cave. Tui's chest tightened, his hands shaking. This wasn't Min. Min was gone. Whatever stood before him was nothing more than a puppet, controlled by the shadows. Golf shouted, his voice cracking. You're not Min, get away from us. Min's face twisted, her mouth stretching into a grotesque smile, her black eyes locking onto Tui. Tui, come with me, it's safe here, you'll never be alone. He felt a chill run down his spine. The shadows were getting closer, their faces shifting, morphing into familiar shapes. He saw his mother's face, his father's, even his grandfather's, people he had lost long ago. Their faces were perfect, just as he remembered them. But their eyes were empty, soulless, and their smiles were wrong, too wide, too sharp. His mother's voice echoed through the clearing, soft and sweet. Tui, come home, we miss you. His legs wobbled, his heart aching. It sounded just like her, every word dripping with warmth and love. He took a step forward, his body moving on its own. Tui. Don't listen. Golf grabbed his arm, shaking him. It's not real. They're trying to take you. The illusion shattered, and the faces twisted, their smiles warping into sneers. The shadows hissed, their eyes blazing with anger. Ploy screamed as one of the shadows lunged at her, its body stretching unnaturally, its fingers curling into claws. Golf pulled her away just in time, the claws missing her by inches. The shadows closed in, their movements jerky, inhuman, their faces distorting as they whispered in voices that didn't belong to them. Tui, Golf, Ploy, join us forever. Tui looked around, his heart racing. there was no escape. The shadows were everywhere, their eyes gleaming with hunger. He remembered Min's words, her voice trembling as she spoke of the P.4, the shadows that followed the lost, trapping them in the forest until they became shadows themselves. They had been marked the moment they saw the shadows by the campfire. The spirits wouldn't stop until they had taken them all. Tui clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. I won't let them take us. He grabbed a branch from the ground, the wood cold and damp. He swung it at the nearest shadow, but it passed through the creature, dispersing the darkness before reforming with a laugh. The shadow's face morphed, becoming Min's. Tui, you can't leave, you belong to us now. His blood ran cold, but he didn't back down. You're not Min. I won't let you have her. The shadows hissed, their faces contorting with fury. They surged forward, their forms twisting, stretching, their eyes glowing with malice. Tui stepped back, his body trembling. He couldn't fight them. They weren't flesh and blood. They were shadows, ghosts of the lost. Then he remembered the campfire, the light that had kept the shadows at bay. They feared the light. He turned to Golf and Ploy, his eyes blazing with determination. The fire. We need to light a fire. Golf's eyes widened, realization dawning on his face. You're right, shadows can't exist in the light. They scrambled to gather branches, their hands shaking as the shadows drew closer, their whispers growing louder, more desperate. Ploy's voice trembled as she struck the lighter, the flame flickering weakly. Please, please work. The flame caught, the fire roaring to life. Light flooded the clearing, bright and fierce, pushing back the darkness. The shadows screamed, their forms writhing, faces contorting as the light burned them. They shrank back, their bodies dissolving, melting into the shadows of the trees. Min's figure stood at the edge of the light, her face twisted in anguish, her black eyes staring at Tui. Don't leave me, Tui. His heart broke, tears streaming down his face. Goodbye, Min. Her face softened, a single tear falling before her body dissolved into smoke, vanishing into the darkness. The whispers faded, the cold air lifting as the forest grew silent once more. They stood around the fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames, eyes hollow with exhaustion. Ploy sobbed softly, her shoulders shaking. Min, she's really gone. Golf's jaw clenched, his fists trembling. Those things took her. Tui stared at the shadows beyond the firelight, his heart heavy. No, she's free now. They can't control her anymore. They stayed by the fire until dawn, too afraid to leave the safety of the light. When morning finally came, they retraced their steps, finding the path out of the forest with ease. The woods were silent, peaceful, the sunlight streaming through the trees. But as they reached the edge of the forest, Tui paused, his body cold. At the base of a tree, just beyond the sunlight, was a shadow. Its form was human, delicate and small, a figure he knew all too well. Min stood there, her face serene, her eyes gentle. She smiled, her lips moving silently, her voice echoing on the wind. Goodbye, Tui. And then she was gone, the shadow melting into the forest, leaving only the rustling leaves behind. Tui swallowed hard, his chest aching. He turned away, walking toward the sunlight where his friends waited. But as he stepped into the light, he swore he heard a whisper. Soft and distant, like the wind through the trees. Tui, don't forget me. He looked back, but the forest was empty. Only shadows remained. The shadow on the tree. The air was heavy with humidity as the group of friends made their way through the dense jungle of northern Thailand. Towering ancient trees loomed above, their branches intertwining to form a thick canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled patches on the forest floor. The jungle was alive, a cacophony of chirping insects and distant bird calls echoing through the dense undergrowth. It was supposed to be a fun weekend trip and escape from the noise of the city. Tui, Ploy, and Bank had planned this hiking and camping adventure for months. They wanted to disconnect, to breathe the fresh mountain air, and to feel the thrill of the wild. None of them expected the forest to be so overwhelming. The deeper they ventured, the more the air seemed to thicken, the trees growing taller, their twisted branches forming eerie shapes that danced in the shadows. Creepy, ha! Bank chuckled, his voice echoing through the dense trees. No wonder they call this the Whispering Forest. Ploy shivered, glancing at the swaying branches above. Why do they call it that? Bank grinned, his eyes gleaming with mischief. Locals say the trees whisper to each other and to anyone who dares to listen. Tui rolled his eyes, playfully nudging Bank. Quit trying to scare her. It's just the wind, but deep down, he couldn't shake off the feeling that they were being watched. The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. The forest grew darker, the shadows lengthening as they finally found a clearing to set up camp. The clearing was surrounded by towering trees, their branches reaching high above, their ancient trunks thick and gnarled. One tree stood apart from the rest, a massive, twisted banyan tree with sprawling roots that clawed through the earth like giant serpents. Its branches were dense, their shadows intertwining, forming dark shapes against the fading light. Ploy frowned as she stared at the tree, her voice barely above a whisper. "That tree, it feels off." Tui glanced up, his eyes tracing the dark outlines of the twisted branches. "Yeah, it's huge. Must be hundreds of years old." Bank laughed, unbothered. "Perfect for a spooky ghost story tonight, huh?" The air around them grew cooler, a sudden breeze rustling the leaves. The branches above swayed, their shadows flickering like dancing figures. A chill ran down Tui's spine, but he shrugged it off. It was just the wind, just the shadows, or so he thought. As they gathered around the crackling campfire, Bank couldn't resist telling a local legend he had heard from his grandmother. "They say this forest is home to the P.op ton by the tree spirits." Bank began, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. "Spirits of those who died tragically or were lost in the forest. Their souls become trapped, clinging to the trees they died under, especially old trees like that one." He pointed to the ancient banyan tree, its twisted branches looming ominously in the darkness. Ploy's face paled, her eyes wide. "And what do they do?" Bank leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They wait, watching from the shadows. If you see them, if they know you've noticed, they follow you, all the way home." A cold breeze swept through the clearing, causing the flames to flicker. The shadows danced across the trees, twisting and warping. For a moment, Tui thought he saw a figure, perched high on one of the branches, a human shape, watching. He blinked, and it was gone. His heart raced, but he forced a laugh. "Nice story, man. You almost had me there." Bank grinned, satisfied. "Almost." Tui didn't answer. He was still staring at the banyan tree, his eyes scanning the branches. There was nothing there, just shadows. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Something that was hiding among the twisted branches, just out of sight. The wind rustled the leaves again, whispering through the trees. A faint sound, almost like laughter. Tui shivered, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. He told himself it was just the wind, but he didn't believe it. Night had fully descended upon the whispering forest. The air was thick with moisture, and the sounds of insects echoed through the darkness. The campfire crackled softly, casting flickering shadows on the faces of Tui, Ploy, and Bank as they sat huddled together, their backs to the massive banyan tree. Bank's ghost story still lingered in the air, an uneasy tension settling over the group. They tried to laugh it off, but every rustle of leaves or crack of a twig made them flinch. Ploy hugged her knees, her eyes darting toward the twisted branches above. Did you guys hear that?" Tui listened, his heart thudding. At first, there was only the sound of the night crickets chirping, the soft whistle of the wind. But then, faint and distant, he heard it too. A whisper, a hushed, indistinct murmur carried on the breeze, like voices speaking just out of reach. It floated through the trees, the words too soft to understand, but unmistakably human. Ploy's face went pale. "It's just like Bank said, the trees they're whispering." Bank's grin faltered, his bravado crumbling. "Come on, it's probably just the wind." But his voice wavered. The whispering grew louder, circling the clearing, moving from tree to tree. It was as if the forest itself was alive, speaking to them in a language they couldn't understand. Then, a shadow moved. Tui's head snapped up, his eyes locked on the banyan tree. Its branches were swaying, the shadows shifting and flickering. High above, nestled among the gnarled limbs, was a shape, a figure. It was perched unnaturally on one of the thick branches, its body twisted at an impossible angle, limbs too long and thin. Its face was pale, devoid of features, except for the hollow, empty eyes. It was watching them. Tui's throat tightened, his body frozen with fear. He tried to speak, but his voice wouldn't come out. He looked at Ploy and Bank, but they were staring at the fire, oblivious to the thing above them. Slowly, he pointed up. "Did you see that?" Bank followed his gaze, his eyes widening. What the hell is that?" Ploy looked up, her scream catching in her throat. No, the figure didn't move. It remained perched on the branch, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its hollow eyes stared down, unblinking, fixated on them. Then, its mouth opened. A gaping, dark void, and the whispering grew louder. The voices were no longer distant. They were right there, swirling around them, echoing from the shadowy branches. The figure's mouth moved, but the voice was all around, seeping into their ears, filling their minds. It was speaking in a language they couldn't understand, a garbled, ancient tongue. But they could feel the malice in its tone, the cold hatred behind every word. Tui grabbed Ploy's arm, his voice trembling. We need to get out of here." Bank was already on his feet, his flashlight shaking in his hand. He aimed the beam at the figure. The light hit the branches, but the figure was gone. Only empty limbs swayed in the breeze. Bank stumbled back, his face pale. Where did it go? The whispering stopped. The forest fell silent. To silent. No insects. No rustling leaves. Just an unnatural, suffocating stillness. Then, from behind them, a crackling sound echoed. Slowly, they turned toward the banyan tree. There, standing beneath its twisted branches, was the figure. Its body was distorted, limbs elongated, bending at unnatural angles. Its face was still featureless, but its hollow eyes were locked on them, filled with a dark, empty void. The air grew cold. The campfire flickered, its flames shrinking, shadows crawling toward them. The figure stepped closer, its movements jerky and inhuman, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. The whispering returned, louder this time, echoing from every direction. Ploy's voice was barely a whisper. "It followed us, it's real, it followed us." Tui grabbed her hand, his eyes wide with terror. "Run!" Without another word, they bolted from the clearing, the shadows chasing after them, the whispering growing louder, echoing through the darkness. The last thing they heard was the crackling of branches, and the laughter, a hollow, echoing laugh that followed them through the trees. Watching, waiting. And somewhere, high above, nestled among the twisted limbs of the banyan tree, the shadow was still there. Watching them flee. It was just the beginning. They ran blindly through the forest, branches whipping at their faces, roots threatening to trip them at every step. The whispering followed, echoing through the trees, growing louder, more insistent. Tui's chest burned as he gasped for air, his legs aching with every stride. But he didn't dare look back. Not after what he had seen. Not after the shadow had moved. Beside him, Ploy stumbled, nearly falling before Tui grabbed her arm, pulling her forward. "Keep going, don't stop." Bank was just ahead, his flashlight beam flickering as he sprinted through the darkness. "There, I see a clearing." They burst out of the tangled undergrowth and into an open space, the moonlight illuminating a small hill. But their relief was short-lived. At the top of the hill, standing beneath the twisted branches of another ancient tree, was the figure. It was waiting for them. Its body was even more distorted than before, limbs elongated and bent at impossible angles. Its head was cocked to the side, hollow eyes fixed on them, unblinking. Ploy's knees buckled as she fell to the ground, tears streaming down her face. No, how did it get here before us?" Bank's voice shook. It's not human." The figure moved, its body jerking unnaturally, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. It took one step down the hill, then another, its limbs bending and cracking as it approached. The whispering grew louder, echoing all around them, circling like a cold wind. The words were still garbled, ancient, but this time, they began to form something familiar. Their names, whispered over and over again, in a mocking, sing-song tone. Tui, Ploy, Bank. Ploy screamed, covering her ears, but the whispering grew louder, penetrating her mind, echoing inside her head. "Stop it, make it stop." Tui pulled her to her feet. "We have to keep moving." But when they turned to run, they found themselves surrounded. Shadows were emerging from the trees, their shapes twisted and distorted, faces pale and hollow. They moved unnaturally, limbs bent and crooked, just like the figure on the hill. Their mouths opened, and the whispering poured out, a cacophony of voices echoing through the clearing. Tui's blood ran cold as he realized they were trapped. The shadows closed in, their eyes empty, their faces void of emotion. They reached out with elongated fingers, their touch cold as ice, draining the warmth from the air. Ploy backed away, stumbling over her words. This can't be real, it can't be." Bank swung his flashlight wildly, the beam passing through the shadows without effect. What are they?" The figure on the hill watched, its hollow eyes gleaming in the moonlight. It opened its mouth, and the whispering stopped. A cold, suffocating silence fell over the clearing. Then it spoke. The voice was a low, guttural growl, echoing from deep within its hollow chest. You trespassed on sacred ground, its head twisted at an unnatural angle, the neck cracking and bending. You heard the whispers, you saw the shadows. Tui's heart pounded, his voice shaking. What do you want? The figure's mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, wide and empty. Your souls, the shadows lunged to you. I felt the cold grip around his wrist, the icy touch sending a jolt of pain through his arm. He tried to pull away, but the shadow's grip tightened, its hollow eyes staring into his soul. Ploy screamed as the shadows surrounded her, their whispers echoing in her mind, filling her with fear and despair. Bank swung his flashlight again, his movements frantic, but the shadows passed right through the light, their faces twisted into ghastly smiles. The figure on the hill watched, its body twitching with unnatural movements, its grin widening. It raised one crooked arm, pointing at them, and the shadows tightened their grip. Tui's vision blurred as the coldness spread through his body, his strength fading. He could feel his spirit being pulled, drawn toward the figure, toward its hollow, empty eyes. The world around him began to fade, the forest growing darker, the whispers echoing in his mind. Then, just as his body went numb, he heard it, a voice, faint, distant, yet familiar, a chanting, rhythmic and melodic, echoing through the trees. The shadows recoiled, their faces twisting in pain. The figure on the hill let out a guttural roar, its body contorting, the hollow eyes burning with anger. The chanting grew louder, echoing from the forest itself, filling the clearing with a warm, protective light. The shadows released their grip, retreating back into the darkness, their whispering turning to wails. The figure screamed, its body twisting and writhing, the shadows melting away. Its hollow eyes locked on Tui one last time, filled with hatred. You cannot escape. With one final roar, the figure collapsed into itself, the shadows vanishing into the ground. The forest fell silent once more. Tui collapsed to his knees, his body trembling, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Ploy and Bank were beside him, their faces pale, their eyes wide with shock. The chanting faded, replaced by the familiar sounds of the night crickets, rustling leaves, the whisper of the wind. The darkness was gone. But the memory of the shadows, of the hollow eyes, and the echoing whispers lingered in their minds. They were safe, for now. The night had grown still, the air heavy with an uneasy silence. Tui, Ploy, and Bank huddled together, their faces pale and eyes wide, still haunted by the hollow whispers and the twisted shadows. They knew they couldn't stay there. Whatever force had saved them, it wouldn't last forever. They needed to leave the forest before the shadows returned. Without a word, they gathered their belongings, hands shaking as they packed their gear. The forest felt different now, colder, darker, as if it were watching them, waiting for them to let their guard down. Bank's voice was barely above a whisper. We need to follow the trail back. As fast as we can. Tui nodded, his jaw clenched, no stopping, no looking back. Ploy's eyes were fixed on the trees, her body tense. What was that chanting? Who saved us? Tui shook his head. I don't know. But we need to go, now. They moved quickly, staying close, their flashlights flickering as they navigated the dense undergrowth. The shadows seemed to shift around them, but nothing emerged. Yet the feeling of being watched never left them. The forest was no longer just a place of nature. It was alive, ancient and angry. As they hurried down the narrow trail, Ploy suddenly stumbled, her foot catching on something half buried in the dirt. She cried out, and Tui grabbed her arm, steadying her. Are you okay? Ploy looked down, her eyes widening. What is that? They all stared at the object protruding from the ground, a carved wooden charm, old and weathered, its surface covered in strange symbols. Bank's face went pale. That's a protection charm, like the ones the elders make in the village. Tui's stomach tightened. You think someone placed it here? To keep that thing away, Ploy shivered. Or to keep it trapped. A cold breeze swept through the trees, and they all felt it, a presence, watching from the shadows, waiting for them to leave. The whispering started again, faint and distant, echoing through the branches. Their names, carried on the wind. Bank's face went white. We need to move, now. They broke into a run, branches whipping at their faces as they stumbled down the path, hearts pounding. The whispering grew louder, mocking, taunting, chasing them through the darkness. As they ran, Tui could feel the shadows closing in, their cold fingers brushing against his skin, pulling at his soul. He didn't dare look back. The trees began to thin, the trail widening as they approached the edge of the forest. Tui's chest burned, his legs aching, but he kept running, the whispering echoing in his mind. Then, just as they broke through the last line of trees, the whispering stopped. They stumbled out into the open field, collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath. The forest loomed behind them, dark and silent, its shadows retreating into the depths. Tui looked back, his body trembling. The presence was still there, watching from the darkness, its hollow eyes gleaming from the branches. It didn't follow them out. It could single quotes the protection charm, the chanting. Whatever ancient power had saved them was keeping the shadows trapped in the forest. But the presence remained, waiting, watching. Banks' voice was barely a whisper. We're safe now, right? Tui looked at the tree line, his heart still racing. I don't know, Ploy shivered, hugging herself. It's still there. It's still watching us. The forest was silent, the darkness still. But they all felt it, the hollow eyes, the whispering that would never truly fade. They turned away, walking slowly back to the village, their bodies exhausted, their souls heavy. None of them spoke as they left the cursed forest behind, but they all heard the final whisper, echoing on the wind, just before they disappeared over the hill. A voice that was cold and hollow, filled with hatred. You cannot escape. They never looked back. The white shadow at the edge of the forest. The campfire crackled softly, sparks dancing into the night sky as the group of friends sat around the warm glow. The forest loomed around them, towering trees swaying gently in the cool evening breeze. It was supposed to be a relaxing getaway, a break from their busy lives in the city. There were 5 of them: Noak, the adventurous one who had organized the trip; Art, the skeptical jokester; Fa, who loved ghost stories but was terrified of the dark; Tum, the practical guy who never believed in anything supernatural; and Mint, the quiet one who always seemed to sense things no one else could. The campsite was nestled at the edge of a dense forest in northern Thailand, known for its ancient legends and mysterious tales. Noak had picked this spot because of the serene surroundings and the breathtaking view of the mountains in the distance. But as night fell, an unsettling feeling crept over them, a cold shiver that seemed to come from the depths of the forest. Hey, Mint, why so quiet? Art teased, poking at the fire with a stick. Don't tell me you're scared already. Mint looked up, her face pale, eyes distant. I just feel like we're being watched. Fa shivered, hugging her knees. Don't say that. I already feel creeped out by this place. Tum laughed, shaking his head. Come on, guys. It's just a forest. There's nothing out there but trees and animals. Noak smirked, her eyes gleaming with excitement. Actually, there's an old legend about this place. Fa's eyes widened. Oh no, don't start. I'll never sleep tonight. But Noak continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. They say that a long time ago, this forest was cursed. A woman was banished here, accused of witchcraft. She died alone, her spirit wandering the edge of the forest, waiting for someone to set her free. People say she appears as a white shadow, gliding through the trees. The fire flickered, the wind picking up, rustling the branches above. A chill ran down their spines, the air growing colder. Art rolled his eyes. Seriously, a ghost story. You really are trying to scare us. Noak shrugged, a playful grin on her face. Believe what you want. But they say if you see her, don't follow. If you do, you'll never come back. Silence fell over the group, the forest echoing with distant whispers. Mint's eyes were fixed on the edge of the trees, her face pale. I think I saw something. The others turned, their eyes following her gaze. For a moment, everything was still, the shadows dancing at the edge of the firelight. Then, just beyond the tree line, a figure appeared, a white shadow, barely visible, gliding between the trees. Its movements were slow, graceful, almost human but not quite. Fa gasped, her body tensing. Did you see that? Art's face went pale, his usual joking demeanor gone. It's probably just fog or something, right? Noak stood up, her curiosity getting the better of her. Let's go check it out. It's probably nothing. Nint grabbed her arm, her voice shaking. No, don't follow it. But Nope pulled away, her eyes fixed on the shadow. Come on, Tum. Let's go. You're not scared, are you? Tum hesitated but followed Nope, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as they approached the tree line. The white shadow seemed to move deeper into the forest, disappearing behind the trees. Nope stepped closer, her voice echoing. Hello, is someone there? No answer. Only the rustling of leaves and the whispering wind. They moved further in, the shadows growing darker, the cold air pressing against their skin. The forest felt alive, watching, waiting. Mint stood at the edge, her eyes wide, tears forming. Please don't go. The others watched, their hearts bounding, breaths shallow. The white shadow appeared again, just ahead of Noak and Tum, gliding between the trees, almost inviting them to follow. Nock's voice was faint, distant. Wait, I see her, she's beautiful. Mint's scream shattered the silence. No, come back, but it was too late. The shadows closed in, swallowing them whole. And the forest whispered, ancient and mournful, echoing with voices long forgotten. The air grew colder as Noak and Tum vanished into the shadows, their flashlights flickering between the ancient trees. The white figure seemed to drift effortlessly, its form ethereal, gliding deeper into the forest. Back at the campsite, Mint's face was pale with fear, tears streaming down her cheeks. We have to go after them, we can't leave them in there. Fa grabbed her arm, her own hands trembling. No, Mint, you saw what I saw. That thing wasn't human. Art's face was drained of color, his usual confidence shattered. But we can't just leave them. It's just a trick of the light, right? Maybe they got lost. Mint shook her head violently. No, it's the curse, the woman in white. Nope shouldn't have told that story, she called it to us. The wind howled through the trees, a haunting wail that made their blood run cold. Shadows danced at the edge of the firelight, twisting and curling like ghostly figures. Art took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. I'm going after them. Tum's got the only other flashlight. If they're lost, we need to find them before they go too far. Fa looked at him, her eyes pleading. Art, don't, please, I don't want to lose you too. He looked at her, his expression softening. I'll be fine. I'll just check the edge of the forest. If I don't see them, I'll come right back. Before anyone could stop him, Art grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the tree line. The shadows seemed to stretch toward him, welcoming him into the darkness. Mint's voice was a whisper, her eyes fixed on the trees. It wants us to follow, it's leading us in. Fa hugged her knees, rocking back and forth. This isn't happening, this isn't real, it's just a stupid ghost story. But Mint's gaze never wavered. It's real and it's hungry. Art moved cautiously between the trees, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was heavy, damp, the scent of earth and decay filling his nose. Every step seemed to echo the forest and naturally quiet. Noak, Tum, where are you guys? His voice felt small, swallowed by the shadows. A faint whisper drifted through the air, distant and haunting. He couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a woman, soft, melodic, calling his name. Art's heart raced, his pulse pounding in his ears. Hello, who's there? The whisper grew louder, coming from deeper within the forest. The shadows seemed to move, shifting like dark figures watching from a distance. He took a step forward, his instinct screaming at him to turn back. But then he saw a glimpse of white, just ahead, moving behind the trees. His breath caught in his throat. It looked like a woman, dressed in flowing white, her hair long and dark, her movements graceful and slow. He followed without thinking, his feet moving on their own. Hey, wait. The figure drifted further away, weaving between the ancient trees, her form barely visible in the darkness. Art stumbled, his flashlight flickering. The whispers grew louder, echoing all around him. They were calling his name, over and over, beckoning him closer. He felt cold, his body numb, his thoughts hazy. It was like a dream, surreal and disorienting. The woman in white turned, her face still hidden in shadow. Her arms stretched out, a delicate finger pointing deeper into the forest. Art's legs moved on their own, his body compelled to follow. The whispers grew frantic, desperate, like cries of pain and sorrow. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way. He fell, his body tumbling into darkness, his flashlight spinning out of his hand. He hit the earth hard, pain radiating through his body. The air was cold, damp, the scent of rotting leaves surrounding him. He tried to move, but his body felt heavy, paralyzed. The whispers were louder now, echoing all around him, filling his ears. Through the shadows, he saw them figures, pale and translucent, drifting toward him. Their faces were twisted in agony, eyes hollow and empty. They were reaching for him, their hands skeletal, their mouths open in silent screams. The woman in white stood above them, her face finally visible. It was beautiful, serene ... but her eyes were dark voids, empty and soulless. She smiled, her face twisting, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide. Her voice was soft, echoing through his mind. "Stay with me forever." Art tried to scream, but no sound came out. The shadows engulfed him, the whispers consuming him, and then silence. Back at the campsite, Min stared into the darkness, her face pale and lifeless. She knew Art wasn't coming back. Fa sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking. "What do we do now? We're all going to die here." Min's voice was hollow, her eyes distant. "It wants us to follow. It feeds on our curiosity, our fear." Fa looked at her, panic in her eyes. "Then how do we get out?" Min turned to her, her face expressionless. "We don't." The wind howled, the shadows twisting, dancing at the edge of the firelight. And from the darkness, the whispers continued, calling their names. The campfire flickered, struggling against the cold breeze that whispered through the trees. The shadows danced around Min and Fa, their faces pale with fear. Min's eyes were fixed on the darkness where Art had disappeared. She gripped her knees, her knuckles white. "They're gone, all of them. The forest took them." Fa shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, they're just lost. We have to find them. We can't leave them out there." Min turned to her, her expression empty. "If we go in, we won't come back." "That's what it wants." Fa's lip trembled. "What are you talking about? What wants?" Min's voice was hollow. "The woman in white, the spirit that Noak told us about. She was warning us and we didn't listen." Fa's eyes widened in horror. "You can't be serious. That's just a story." Min's gaze never wavered. "It's not just a story. It's a curse. She lures people into the forest and they never leave." The air grew colder, the shadows around them stretching longer. The trees seemed to sway, their branches creaking like old bones. Fa looked around, her chest tightening with panic. We need to get out of here. Now." Min nodded, her face pale. "Before she comes for us." They grabbed their backpacks, hastily shoving their belongings inside. The fire sputtered, the light dimming, leaving the forest in eerie darkness. Fa's hands were shaking as she picked up her flashlight. She flicked the switch, but it wouldn't turn on. No, not now." Min's flashlight was dead too. The air was heavy, the darkness pressing in around them. A cold breeze swept through the clearing, carrying with it a faint whisper. It was soft, melodic, and it was calling their names. Fa's heart stopped. Did you hear that?" Min's face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "She's here." The whispers grew louder, circling them, echoing through the trees. The shadows seemed to move, dark figures shifting at the edge of the clearing. Fa took a step back, her body trembling. We need to run now." But before they could move, the darkness came alive. A figure emerged from the shadows, gliding across the ground without a sound. It was a woman, dressed in flowing white, her hair long and dark, her face hidden in shadow. She moved slowly, gracefully, her form ethereal, almost transparent. Her feet never touched the ground, her body floating just above the earth. Fa's breath caught in her throat. "No, this can't be real." Min grabbed her arm, her fingers cold as ice. "Don't look at her, don't speak to her no matter what you hear." The woman's head tilted, her face still hidden. She began to hum, a haunting melody that echoed through the trees. Fa's body went rigid, her mind foggy. The sound was beautiful, hypnotic. She felt herself being drawn toward it. Min tightened her grip. "Fa, snap out of it." Fa's eyes blinked, her senses returning. She stumbled backward, breaking free from the spell. What is she?" Min's voice was barely a whisper, a spirit cursed to wander these woods hungry for souls. The woman in white glided closer, her arms outstretched, her fingers long and skeletal. The shadows around her seemed to writhe, twisting and curling like serpents. She opened her mouth, and the whispers grew louder, overlapping voices calling out to them. Mint's face went pale. Don't listen, she's trying to lure us in like she did with the others. Fuzz's eyes were wide with terror. What do we do? How do we stop her? Mint shook her head. You can't stop her, you can only run. The woman's face began to lift, revealing her features. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, her eyes hollow voids of darkness. Her mouth stretched into an unnatural smile, sharp teeth gleaming in the moonlight. The shadows around her surged forward, reaching out with skeletal hands. The air grew colder, the ground beneath them turning icy. Mint grabbed Fuzz's hand. Run. They turned and bolted into the forest, branches whipping against their faces, the whispers chasing after them. The trees seemed to close in, their twisted forms like grasping arms. The woman's laughter echoed through the darkness, a haunting, chilling sound. Her figure glided after them, faster than humanly possible, her body moving unnaturally, her limbs bending at impossible angles. Fuzz just burned as she ran, her legs trembling with exhaustion. Mint, I can't keep running. Mint's face was filled with fear. You have to if you stop, she'd take you. The whispers were all around them, the shadows shifting, blocking their path. The forest was alive, pulsing with malevolent energy. The woman's face appeared between the trees, her hollow eyes fixed on them, her mouth whispering their names. Her body twisted, crawling along the branches like a spider, her limbs bending grotesquely. Foss screamed, her voice echoing through the forest. They stumbled into a clearing, the moonlight illuminating the ancient stones that circled the area. Mint's eyes widened. This is where it happened. Fa looked at her, confused. What are you talking about? Mint's voice trembled. Nox's story, the woman in white, this is where she died, where her curse began. The air grew colder, the shadows closing in around them. The woman's figure stood at the edge of the clearing, her body contorted, her face twisted in anger. Her voice was a wail, filled with pain and sorrow. Join me, stay with me forever. Fa backed away, her body trembling. No, please. Mint's eyes were wide with fear. There's no way out, she won't let us leave. The ground beneath them began to shift, hands reaching up from the earth, skeletal fingers grasping at their ankles. The whispers grew louder, overwhelming, voices filled with anguish. The woman's face twisted into a cruel smile. You can never leave. The shadows surged forward, the darkness consuming them. Fa's scream echoed through the clearing as the skeletal hands clawed at her legs, their grip icy and unrelenting. She struggled, kicking and thrashing, but they were impossibly strong. Mint, help me. She cried, her fingers digging into the dirt as she tried to pull herself free. Mint was frozen, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. The woman in white stood at the edge of the clearing, her hollow eyes fixed on them, her mouth stretched into an unnatural smile. Her voice was soft, melodic, yet filled with malice. Stay with me forever. The air was frigid, the shadows swirling around them, whispering their names. Fuzz's body trembled, the cold seeping into her bones. Her strength was fading, her limbs growing numb. Mint, please don't leave me. Mint's eyes filled with tears. She took a deep breath, shaking herself free from the paralysis of fear. She ran to Fa's side, grabbing her arms and pulling with all her strength. I won't leave you, the shadows hissed, tightening their grip. The skeletal hands clawed at Fa, dragging her toward the darkness. Mint's muscles burned, her vision blurred from exhaustion. But she refused to let go. We're getting out of here together. The woman's face contorted in anger, her body twisted, limbs bending at unnatural angles as she glided closer. The shadows around her pulsed, alive with hatred. Mint's heart raced as she watched the woman approach, her hollow eyes glowing with malice. She looked down at Fa, desperation filling her voice. You have to fight, don't give in to her, don't let her take you. Fa's eyes were heavy, her strength fading. She could feel the cold creeping up her body, pulling her into the darkness. But Mint's voice broke through the fog in her mind. She gritted her teeth, summoning the last of her strength. I won't let her. With a cry of determination, Fa kicked against the skeletal hands, her body trembling from the effort. The shadows hissed, their grip loosening just enough for Mint to pull her free. They stumbled backward, collapsing to the ground. The shadows writhed in anger, the woman's face twisting into a furious snarl. Her voice echoed through the clearing, filled with rage and sorrow. "You cannot escape." The earth trembled, the skeletal hands clawing up from the ground, reaching toward them. The shadows swirled, forming dark figures with hollow eyes and gaping mouths. Mint pulled Fa to her feet, her voice shaking. "We need to get out of this clearing. It's the source, it's where she died. Her curse is strongest here." Fa's eyes widened in realization. Then if we leave, maybe she can't follow. They turned and ran, the shadows screaming behind them. The woman's wail was filled with anguish, her body twisting as she reached out, her fingers elongated, skeletal claws. The ground shifted beneath them, the forest itself trying to trap them. The trees bent inward, their branches like grasping arms. Fa's legs were heavy, her body numb with cold. But she kept running, her fingers locked with Mint's, refusing to let go. The shadows closed in, swirling around them, whispering their names. The woman's face appeared between the trees, her hollow eyes fixed on them, her voice echoing through the darkness. Stay with me forever." Fa's heart pounded, her chest burning as she ran. "No, we won't become one of you." They burst through the tree line, stumbling out into the open forest. The air was warmer, the shadows retreating, their whispers fading. Mint looked back, her eyes wide with disbelief. The woman in white stood at the edge of the forest, her body twisted and broken, her face filled with sorrow. She reached out, her fingers trembling, her voice a faint whisper, "Don't leave me alone." Her body began to fade, the shadows consuming her. Her face contorted in pain, her eyes hollow and empty. The darkness wrapped around her, pulling her back into the forest, her form dissolving into the shadows. The trees straightened, the air growing still. The whispers were gone, the darkness retreating into the depths of the forest. Mint and Fa stood in stunned silence, their bodies trembling, their faces pale. Fa's voice was barely a whisper. Is it over?" Mint swallowed, her eyes locked on the spot where the woman had disappeared. "I don't know, but we're not staying to find out." They turned and ran, their footsteps echoing through the forest. The sun was rising, the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. But as they fled, a faint whisper carried on the breeze, soft and sorrowful, "Forever alone." The forest watched them go, its shadows lingering just beyond the light, waiting patiently for the next souls to wander too close.
If you enjoyed today's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel, Mystical Tales, so you won't miss out on more eerie and thrilling tales in the future. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.